Well, thank you, everyone. Welcome to this panel. We are halfway into the current legislative term, which means also we are halfway until the next EU elections and the new College of Commissioners. It is therefore a good time for EDRI, for European Digital Rights, and other NGOs and digital rights advocates to look backwards and also forward to analyze the impact, adapt strategies, and receive constructive criticism of our work. Looking backwards, and the purpose of this panel is to have an overview on how it has been for digital rights so far in the current EU legislative term. This means how well have digital rights been defended? Are we advancing? Are we creating more legislation that perhaps will never be enforced? How are civil society groups doing? Are we being effective? Are we engaging with people outside the EU bubble? And also, how do the members of the European Parliament, also academia, see us? How do they perceive our work? This is looking backwards, but looking forward, being halfway until the next elections also means it is also a good moment to take 2-3 takeaways of what to expect by 2024. So what is the next Digital Services Act type of legislation that is coming, or what we should be pushing to be proposed by the next College of Commissioners? Or should we perhaps, both policymakers and human rights groups, focus rather in the implementation? We have the GDPR, we have the e-privacy sometime soon, hopefully the regulation, the DSA soon, the DMA, we in the process of adopting the Artificial Intelligence Act. And European Data Rights is also starting an internal review process in this moment, and we're trying to take all of these questions into consideration. With this panel, we hope that we will be able to obtain some analytical and strategic tools for civil society to face the existing and future challenges that we are facing. And in order for this panel to be relevant for all of us, I'd like to encourage self-criticism of strategies and acknowledging what could have worked better, so we can address these failures in our current and future work, but also to recognize all the progress that we have achieved so far. So summarizing some of the questions we are going to try to respond today are the ones that I'm going to be pasting in the chat. So how are the European Commission and the European Parliament standing in terms of digital rights and policies? What are the biggest threats to the rights of EU citizens now, at the halfway point to the next EU elections? And where should we focus our energies in 2024 and beyond? As you know, my name is Diego Naranjo. I'm the head of policy of European digital rights. I have 4 wonderful speakers coming from the European Parliament, from civil society, and from academia. In the interest of time, I will avoid reading any biographies, and I'm going to head directly to the first round of questions. I will start with you, Alexandra. Alexandra Gese is, of course, a well-known MEP, a member of the group of the Greens European Free Alliance. She's not only a member of the Internal Market and Consumer Protection Committee, where we all know her very well. She's also part of the Budget Committee and the Artificial Intelligence in a Digital Age Committee. And she's also a former interpreter in the European Parliament. And so, Alexandra, even though you have worked in the EP before, this is, if I'm not wrong, your first term as an MEP. And you quickly showed the interest in working on digital issues. Since then, and we know well, you and your team, you have been working on very intensively on a number of dossiers, namely, but not only the Digital Services Act and the Artificial Intelligence Act. So the DSA was voted last week, which marks a positive step forward to advance human rights online. I think it's a great victory for all of us. It is a bit clear, at least for me, where the AI Act will be heading to. And now that we are halfway in the legislation, what is the balance? What is the balance so far for digital rights generally for you?
Thank you, Diego. Thank you for those kind words, and thanks for having me here. Well, difficult question. For me personally, I think the balance is positive because working on the Digital Services Act, I believe what we achieved last Thursday in plenary is amazing. It's a lot more than we expected when we started out. I remember when I started working on this the line was more, well, we have to defend the existing situation to make sure that liability exemption will hold and so on. And now we got really so much more. We got users' rights, we got good notice and action, complaint management, out of court settlement, and we got what is even more important for the very large online platforms. We got the risk assessments and especially external scrutiny, even by independent researchers and by independent NGOs, which I think is absolutely a game changer. So I think the DSA will not, it will not be felt maybe from the first day for individuals, but the structural change this will bring about, that we can finally look under the hood of what these platforms are doing, is really, really important. And that is, I think, one of the areas where EDWI could focus, or NGOs in general could focus the work on, try to be in touch with the networks of NGOs and researchers and universities all over Europe to define research projects that you can do on the basis of Article 31, trying to tell the stories of what happens in the digital space and what is the influence on everyday lives of people and on politics. Because I think one of my difficulties, but everybody's difficulties with telling, with changing the political attitude towards digital policy, is that it's so abstract. There's no images, there are very little stories except of individuals. And it's so difficult to tell the story because it's so complicated. Explain the DSA to a normal person, it's almost impossible. It takes you 10 minutes and then the person is not listening anymore. So I think one thing we should be doing all together is trying to tell the story. So for Germany, it might be, why do we have all these fans of natural medicine from the south of Germany who are marching in the streets against COVID together with Nazis from the east or other places? And this is about targeting, this is a digital topic. But as long as you don't have the research to back it up, so you need the evidence, you need to access to the data to have the evidence, and you need to be able to tell the story, and you need to be able to tell a story about real people in order to elicit emotions, and then people will be ready to act. So I think that is a really important task for NGOs and for EDWI to look around. I mean, who are interesting people, who are NGOs interested in doing this, telling them about this possibility the DSA offers, and maybe try to see who are the universities that are maybe not funded by Google and Facebook and who could do the research part, the mathematical part, the data analysis, and so on. I think that's one thing that is really important. Maybe I just stop here because with so many people on the panel, I have more points, but I just stop here for the moment.
Okay, that was good. I was looking forward to see what you were going to follow up. Let's leave it for later. And Asha, perhaps we can continue with you, because I think what Alexandra was saying on the need to tell stories, to find the evidence and make all of these digital rights abstract type of policy speech, making it a bit more concrete for people. And you come from the European Women's Lobby, where you joined, and you were already working on digital affairs, and you joined CDTs last year. You were the advocacy director for Europe Online Expression Civic Space at CDT, for those of you who do not know her yet. So what do you think? How can we start telling stories? How can we build on the evidence that we are gathering? Some of us are either researchers or in the civil society are gathering evidence. So how can we tell better these stories? And how does it, especially in the case of marginalized groups and for people on the ground, and how can we make them involved in policy making, since sometimes or very often they are the most impacted by some of the digital rights policies?
Thank you very much, Diego, and thank you for the invitation to speak on this really important panel. I'm so honored to be supported by so many allies here. And as you mentioned, kind of coming from that gender equality, digital rights expertise background, it really was at the foundation about seeing the intersections between digital rights policies and existing equality legislation, equality laws, and existing equality policies. For those of us who've been in that online gender-based violence space, especially for the last kind of 5 or 6 years, back in 2017, it was still like a niche subject. We had some political awareness, mainly from politically engaged women who unfortunately had firsthand experience of the issues that we were talking about. But the small communities who focused on online gender-based violence couldn't have imagined that we were having the conversations that we're having right now. And that's because of the political willingness that we have seen, which I think taps into where we are in the middle of this term. We are seeing a lot more political willingness from champions such as Alexandra in the European Parliament, but in the European institutions. And I think as civil society, we are always hoping for that political will to be there so that we're able to move that needle forward. But specifically when it comes to marginalized groups and tapping into that conversation on fundamental rights, I would actually say we need to go beyond stories, because at this moment in time, I think stories very much give a personality to the abstract. And this is incredibly important. Trying to explain the DSA in short, concrete terms and how this directly impacts on a person can be quite difficult to do. But when you're looking at it through an intersectional perspective and intersectional lens of looking at the impacts of the things that we're talking about on marginalized groups, this is where you can get a better shape of what we're looking at here. But the reason I say that we also go beyond stories is because we also need to go into the adoption of a clear intersectional methodology in our policy making, and also need to be very, very aware, and just to be quite truthful, that the EU policy making space and the tech space and the digital rights space remains somewhat homogenous. I work with a group of incredible activists on the Who Writes the Rules campaign initiated by Digital Action. And this is a group of 6 women of color who are calling on the EU institutions to do better on their commitments when it comes to inclusion of marginalized groups. Often we may be invited in the room to share our stories, but it needs to go beyond that. It needs to go into helping with the policy making and the decision making and the analysis and being there as the researchers as well at the same time. So it's a multifaceted approach. So often when I have this conversation, I always remind people that intersectionality is a concrete methodology and framework for analyzing the interplay between class, race, and gender. It's not a checklist exercise when you kind of refer to marginalized groups, but it's an actual strategy that you could put into industry, into policy making, and into research as well. So it's quite important. We have to maximize on the opportunity that we have, where fundamental rights has been at the core. Some of the conversations around the Digital Services Act, for example, I think so many of the wins that we saw from the plenary last week were based because we had people really championing fundamental rights in this legislation. But we can go a step further and really think about, what are we talking about when we say fundamental rights? Whose fundamental rights, and how are those different rights interplaying with each other, and how do they manifest in real terms?
Thank you, Asha. And that's actually a very good link to bring Joris van Hoeken with us. He's a previous postdoctoral research fellow at the Information Law Institute at New York University. But we haven't met before. I met Joris when he was still at the board of directors of the Dutch digital rights organization, Bits of Freedom, for which he was the chairman. So he was a long time EDRI friend. And so, Joris, I think you also were interested in this issue of fundamental rights being at the core of EU tech policy making. And when we were preparing this panel, you were mentioning how it was a bit surprising how fundamental rights have become so central in this discourse. So, how do you see this change in policy making in the last 10 years? Is it a change? Is it a real concern for fundamental rights? Is it just on the superficial level? Is it just a way to add in the end of some amendments and the respect of fundamental rights, and to do some sort of a tick box exercise, as Allen was mentioning? What do you think?
Well, thanks first of all for having me. It's a real pleasure also to be here with amongst the other speakers. So maybe the first I would say is that, reflecting on the state of play from a digital rights perspective, from a perspective of EDRI, it just strikes me that, it's not the first time that we speak about this, but there's really such an avalanche of regulatory proposals and also other legal developments that are extremely relevant in this space. The targets that are being regulated also are immensely powerful and complex and very fast moving, you know, both in the government space and in the private sector space. So it's really it's a rather challenging environment. And I mean, we know that Europe and the European Union and the European Commission has this, you know, particular appetite to regulate, you know, because maybe other political tools like spending money in different directions, you know, that is not so available to Europe. There's not so much flexibility there. So, you know, furthering the European project means typically that there will be more regulation, more harmonization. But it's very striking how much on the is there on the table. We have mentioned already a few files that are very important, but there are a ton of other files that are very important from a fundamental rights perspective and a digital rights perspective. And there's actually hardly anything at the table nowadays, politically speaking, that doesn't touch, of course, on the digital in one way or another. So a bigger reflection I have on that is that, in my view, the digital transformation presents the European Union with somewhat of a constitutional opportunity, like it's a constitutional moment to kind of re-articulate itself in this time. No, so and one of the ways I mean, it does that through a lot of these kind of regulatory proposals, very, very active engagement with policy making, with new legislation. And what we can see is that the digital rights, fundamental rights, have really become very, very central to that regulatory project of articulating Europe with respect to that the challenges of the digital transformation. And that is quite different, I think, if we look back 20 years ago. And if we look longer back, of course, Europe and European Union had a rather ambiguous relationship with fundamental rights, you know, before the Charter, and when, you know, Europe was really much more about an internal market project, which of course it still is. You know, it is still, Europe is very much about the digital single market, the single market, but fundamental rights have become very central to that. So with that, I think also that presents communities that are, you know, really fighting for fundamental rights in protection, kind of to get them protected in a very meaningful way, but somewhat of a challenge, because like that fundamental rights becoming kind of a more mainstream thing that is on the table. So I do agree with what Asha was saying, that we have to be looking very carefully what is actually meant with protecting fundamental rights. You know, just to give one particular example, in the context of the Digital Services Act, one of the fundamental rights that is obviously very much at stake is the right to freedom of expression. But how do we define that right? What is in the end the purpose of that right? Is it a very basic kind of little bit superficial understanding that any communication that is free and unhindered is free speech, and everything that has some kind of restricting effect on what people can say, you know, that is bad. So more speech is good, less speech, restrictions is a bad thing from freedom of expression. I think that is an understanding of freedom of expression that is typically furthered in a lot of conversations. But of course, it disconnects us from what are ultimately the underlying goals of freedom of expression. And obviously also it can easily create dynamics where marginalized groups are being pushed out of the public debate, where, you know, actually we don't get the voices that we should all be hearing, you know, in our public discussion. So I think that is super important with fundamental rights going mainstream. I think it's the role of EDRI and other civil society actors to really to articulate what these rights should really mean in practice, and so maybe paying a little bit more attention to the politics of fundamental rights in the EU dynamics.
Thank you, Joris. I'm gonna follow up now with Dana, but for the rest of the speakers, feel free, please, to to react directly to each other, feel free to raise your hand either electronically on the bottom right of the corner or physically showing me your hand. Because I'd like to keep this as an open conversation. But let's pass on first to Anna. Anna Fielder, she's our EDRI president. She's also currently the senior policy advisor and chair emerita of Privacy International, one of our members. Also the senior policy advisor to the Transatlantic Consumer Dialogue. She covers all types of aspects of consumer policy, from regulations to digital rights, and she works also independently as a policy research advisor for other public interest organizations. So Anna, I guess you will have a lot of things to react to all of this. You have the two hats, the US side, on the EU side, you have an extensive experience. So I guess you want to react to what our colleagues said already.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and I'm really pleased to be on such a distinguished panel with such brilliant colleagues. I actually agree with parts of everything that my colleagues said previously on this panel. So maybe I can connect in different ways, and since I'm the old ancient one here, and I was around and campaigning during the GDPR days, I can actually put my EDRI hat on and maybe say a little bit what I think has worked for civil society and what hasn't, but also linking it to a lot of the messages that were said previously on this panel. So what I've noticed in the last 10 years since I joined EDRI and since we were campaigning on GDPR, what was quite remarkable during the GDPR campaign is that we had a lot of confluences of very good opportunity, and in particular, the fact that it was the rapporteur for that regulation was a very fundamental rights friendly, supportive person, and I'm obviously referring to Jan Albrecht. At that time, EDRI was a relatively small, under-resourced organization. So having this kind of collaboration with the LIBE committee and with a really friendly rapporteur was essential. And that was very lucky, but it doesn't happen anymore. And it's not quite easy anymore, despite the fact that we've got colleagues like Alexandra Geese that is very supportive and very welcoming to civil society. So the positive things that's happened is that the resources of EDRI and civil society generally have increased considerably. So we can devote more times to campaign, more times to telling stories, like the Citizen Defend Your Face campaign. We can form more alliances, and that's another good thing that happened, that there are more and more NGOs that don't come from the expert digital rights field can actually relate much more to digital rights, and they can tell a story much better than us. I mean, to some extent, to give you a concrete example, in the UK, when it was still a EU member, when we were arguing for the DPA Data Protection Act implementation, we managed to get through a lot of positive changes by telling the children's stories. Children are always a good constituency to tell stories. You know, when in my old days, they used to say, if you want politicians to make changes, find children, animals, or dead bodies. And this is probably still true today. So I think, you know, we've seen a lot of progress on the part of NGOs, but I've also got very deep questions of where we go in the future, and it is linked to something that Yuri said and also what Alexandra has said. We have a tsunami of legislation. there's more coming down the line on different aspects of digital. It's all pervasive. We spend a lot of effort on the European Parliament legislation, detailed comments on all the amendments. Do we really need to do that in the future? Or is it something much more effective that we can do, for example, on the alliance side, on the campaigning side, on the storytelling side, on what Asha is saying, you know, finding the right visions, and also, you know, I would like to know, do we need this tsunami of laws? Because whatever happens in the next 10 years, there's more coming down the line. There's the driverless cars, there are the robots, there's even smarter cities. And, do we need to concentrate more on the fundamentals and find something overarching and visionary that can sort the fundamental rights, the economics, the ethical aspects, and so on? Maybe I'll stop here because I got lots more to say, but I don't want to speak too long.
Okay, every speaker ends with a fantastic cliffhanger, letting us there, waiting to hear more from them. Alexandra, you're the policymaker in the room, and many, if not all of the speakers have mentioned the tsunami of legislation. So I'd like to hear, how do you see that specifically? You want to react to that? And also a bit different, I'd like to see, to hear from you. The first time I met you, I realized you were very direct, very critical, which is fantastic. And so I wanted to hear from you. I'd like you to be critical and direct. Since the beginning of this legislative term, when you became MEP, you were very receptive to NGOs who worked on topics such as user rights. And you probably received many meeting requests, even more, in fact, from the industry. So there's no need to ask you if industry is more present than civil society, but I'd like you, if you can, in addition to reply to the tsunami of legislation, to try to let us know, how do you balance the impact of the tsunami of the industry trying to act on the tsunami of legislation, and the small but increasing group of digital rights groups? How do you see that?
Yeah, thank you for that complicated question. I start being a little bit worried about all these people telling me I'm very direct. I think that might be a lack of diplomacy, diplomatic skills as well. But yeah, I take it as a compliment for this time. There is indeed a tsunami of legislation coming, directly political advertising, which I think will give us the chance to reopen the battle on surveillance advertising, explaining even better, having even better stories, and getting politicians even a lot more involved. So I think that is one. And the AI Act obviously is the big one that everybody's already working on, and it's a tsunami even for us, because even we are paid for just doing that and have a team to do that, to sort of lose control over what's going on and can't cover everything. In terms of, I really don't know how to solve the problem that obviously companies have a lot more lobbying power than NGOs. I mean, I personally try to say, my team is supposed to organize meetings 50% civil society and 50% companies. But the requests that are coming, it's like 98% come from companies, and we ignore like hundreds of them. So it's really difficult, and I don't know how to solve that. I mean, there's specific issues in specific countries, like in Germany we have fiscal issues and so on. But I think on a European level, I just don't have the solution. To be very, very honest, I just do what I can to have you on board, to talk as much as possible. I think Anna made an important point, saying, well, maybe we don't need to do detailed comments on every single amendment. I mean, I think as like the same way that I have to prioritize, and I just can't do everything I know would be helpful, and I try to pick just this 1, 2, 3 important political points and to work on those. I think that's what you can do as well. What has been very successful, I think, in this term, especially around surveillance advertising, which is the campaign that I've been, pushing and following most, was the alliance building. I mean, that was really exceptional, like 5 NGOs working together. So maybe you can use that for some kind of division of labor. So some people in one law specialize in one aspect of it and others in others, just do some division of labor. And so, because just very frankly, policymakers don't read 100 different comments on 3,000 amendments. There's just no way to do that. So maybe it's important to pick those aspects that you specialize on, exchange a little bit with other NGOs, and then put that forward. I mean, that's probably what you're already doing, but I have seen very long comments from your part, and I know how much work is involved, and maybe there's a way to deal with that better. We won't solve the problem that Google has so much more money than EDRI. That's, nobody has the solution of us, I think. There are a couple of more points I wanted to make. I think Joris' point about what exactly is freedom of expression was extremely important, because that's something I've been particularly struggling with, and some of you have followed that with the issues on the porn platforms, where we clearly have that issue. What is freedom of expression? Is it just being able to post and say and post any image you wanna post, or is it about making sure that everybody is included in the conversation? And that today is not the case. So I think an organization like EDRI has a really important role in taking this conversation forward, because nobody has the exact solution for that. Two more points like that where I think the conversation is shifting, and where I really appreciate your contribution, is that when I started, privacy was very much seen as an individual right. So as long as I, as an individual, can protect myself from being spied on, everything is fine. And I think what we're seeing now is that privacy is something that preserves democracies, because it keeps governments, but also private companies, from manipulating society as a whole or larger population groups. So I think that is a paradigm shift that still needs to be pronounced more clearly and made more clear and open, and be worked on and discussed. That privacy is really not only an individual instrument, but it's a collective instrument to protect democracy. And the other one is that privacy is important to implement, not only against governments, but against private actors as well, because what we see today is that the platforms, private actors, are more powerful than most governments, actually. And that is something that not everybody who is an activist in terms of digital rights is sharing as a view. So I think that's already also so very, very, very important. But that's, I think, basically my most important points. I have to say I've been extremely happy about our cooperation, working with you and the other NGOs. I mean, what we achieved in the DSA last week would not have been possible without you, absolutely not. So your role was absolutely instrumental, absolutely crucial, and I'm extremely grateful. So I'm not here to give advice, but rather to thank you for what you're already doing, and I think you'll be in a great place to continue doing that.
Thank you, Alexandra. I wish those were your final words and we can finish with that, but we're going to continue. Thank you for being both direct and very kind. And Asha, I know you wanted to react to the tsunami issue and how the harmonization, the enforcement and implementation. What do we do with all of this?
So yeah, I would love to touch on those issues, but I can't not take the opportunity to touch on the other ones as well. I'm just absolutely +1 Alexandra there on the paradigm shift when it comes to talking about privacy, because one of the aspects that we've been following and kind of using the perspective that we have is that what is going to be the impact of these legislations on online civic spaces. We're in a context in which consistently we are looking at shrinking civil society space in Europe, but also globally. And so this is kind of the lens that we're looking through this. And it's so important that that collective dynamic is kind of understood, because then it relates to what I was talking about earlier in terms of the impact on marginalized groups and how that manifests in that sort of way. And once again, to +1 on the civil society collaboration, we've had the honor of working so closely with all of you on these different pieces. And I think that's been the strength. I come from a background in which working together, women's organizations having to come together, even on the minuscule amount of capacity and funding that's necessary and that's available to be able to work miracles. And so this is really our strength, that coordination and coming together. But it's not just with the digital rights colleagues that we may be more familiar with. It is about those other organizations who are working on these issues from their different perspectives. I know that we're in close collaboration with, say, the European Disability Forum and anti-racism networks and LGBT networks and women's networks. And I think we really need to maximize on that. So maybe a thought in terms of what the digital rights field can be doing next. I know we're already doing this, but we definitely have the opportunity to ramp up on this as we move forward. But when it comes to the harmonization and the tsunami of legislation, I'm definitely taking that term with me after this session. But I think the biggest thing here is around harmonization. I know we were kind of addressing this question on, do we need more and what do we need to do? And when it comes to harmonization, I mean, there's the traditional EU sense of ensuring regulations are equally parachuted out into the 27 member states. But more importantly, I would highlight the need to harmonize between the different legislative pieces, as Alexandra was getting to, that are coming up that may not even necessarily be at the forefront of the mind when it comes to this. So we have the online political ads for sure. And I think big questions are going to have to be addressed in this, and we'll be engaging quite a lot because there are, how effective is this going to be? How much is it going to align with the Digital Services Act? Do the provisions make sense? And how do certain articles work? And I won't get into the details of that, but we have some questions around how this will work and how it will be effective. But we also know that there's going to be a directive or some sort of legislation on gender-based violence, which will include obligations for platforms to address online gender-based violence. How is this going to work in line with the other legislations that we have on our hands? How is it going to be effective to actually help survivors and have preventative measures to make sure that we are addressing the issues that we're trying to address? So this brings me all to the conversation around enforcement and implementation. And this is really where the meat of the bones are for the next kind of 2.5 years of this legislative term, really getting into that, because having worked in civil society for a long time, I think when you have a piece of legislation that's well defined, it's fantastic. It's good to have the legislative clarity. It's good to have a framework that you can build upon, and there can be enforcement and mechanisms outlined. But if it is not effectively implemented, it's not going to have the impact that it's intended to have. And so this is where I think the shift and the focus needs to be throughout the rest of this legislative term, but probably into the next one as well, about how do we enforce the mechanisms that we have spent a lot of time and a lot of energy into designing and making sure that they actively work. So whether we need new legislation in the next term is a very good question. I think just in general, continuity of these 5-year EU terms needs to be a fundamental thread that moves forward. But I would really just love to see the shift be there. How is this going to work practically, and how are we going to make sure it's as effective as possible?
Thank you, Asha. Anna, you raised your hand, and perhaps in addition to what you might want to react to, I'd like also to hear your views on the issue of enforcement, because as you said, you were involved in the GDPR negotiations. I arrived halfway or closer to the end of the GDPR, but I'm also curious to hear your views on the issue of enforcement. But please go ahead.
Yeah, I raised my hand because I wanted to react directly to what Asha was saying and continue that conversation, which is effectively about member states and then enforcement, of course. We must remember that, the EU does harmonization and regulations, but not all member states are equal. And by that, I mean in the way they interpret legislation, in the way they treat civil society, and in the way they are willing to enforce this legislation. And I myself come from Eastern Europe, so I'm very, very familiar with that part of the world. And as you know, what's happening now in Hungary and what's happening in Poland is not entirely, conductive to social democracy, not conductive to implementation of these very valuable fundamental rights laws. So I think we need to think very carefully and take that into account also in our NGO strategy. how do we engage civil society, not our EDRI members, but, all civil society in those countries to actually influence more and be heard more and be more developed, because until we learn how to operate effectively in member states, and in some countries we have very powerful members in the Netherlands and France and so on, but we don't in all member states, and those states come into trialogues, they come and negotiate, and they're very, very much influenced by their industries. And we've seen many, many examples of that, including, to come to enforcement, what's happening with the GDPR enforcement in Ireland, for example, where economic consideration, the fact that these companies employ many, many Irish people, have primary consideration over enforcement of the legislation. So how do we deal with that? I mean, what's been really positive in the enforcement of GDPR has been this very rapid development of so-called strategic litigation. We now have many NGO organizations that engage in that. We actually have a specialist litigation member organization in Austria that does fantastic job. Of course, I'm referring to NOIB. But actually, is this the best way? Is litigation the best way to proceed? I mean, we've got the collective redress directive coming on the way and being implemented, and hopefully that will mean that, it will enable at least consumer organizations, because even that directive is very restrictive, to take more collective redress or class action cases, because a lot of the implementation problems with GDPR and other legislation like this, it doesn't show necessarily huge material damage to individuals, but when you take the collective of individual and mass, when you take the future of society and democracy into consideration, the impact is enormous. So I don't think we've solved the enforcement dilemma. And laws such as GDPR allow for too much flexibility that poses too many challenges in enforcement. And litigation is one solution, but it's not ultimately the solution, in my view.
Joris, do you want to react to that?
No, those were all really great comments. I mean, I'm wondering what I was going to say. I mean, maybe. I mean, that question of enforcement, I think the worry is that you can be very effective maybe at the European level, but ultimately those laws are not landing, and what is actually happening in our societies doesn't reflect the laws that end up being adopted at the EU level, and I think that is a real danger. I think with GDPR enforcement, the glass is also half full. It's quite easy to complain about a lot of the things that are not going well, but there's a lot of attention also to the things that are not going well, which is a very good sign. And I think we're all learning from that. The thing that I would say is that it is very important to take a broad view if you want effective protection of digital rights and effectuate fundamental rights protection more generally. I'm a little bit concerned about the kind of outsized role that is sometimes imagined for certain players, like civil society and academia. They get this role in the Digital Services Act. No, the idea seems to be that civil society and academic organizations are going to basically systematically monitor all sorts of ways in which dominant platform companies are presenting issues. And personally, my experience in academia is academics, they like to write papers about new stuff, and then they will move on to new topics. So really doing systematic monitoring, it doesn't really fit, let's put it very bluntly, the academic publication business incentives, the business model of in academia. And I think for civil society, it's a little bit overstretched. And then, I mean, the DSA is a very good example of actually, it's a big change. We're moving from this kind of self-regulatory status quo. We're with a bunch of, pressure, quite a bit of kind of pressure on companies to regulate. We're moving to a place where we're going to have, a whole bunch of obligations and public regulatory oversight. But what is needed, of course, for that to function is a whole bunch of people that understand how that should function in key roles. So what that needs is a whole kind of generation of people with the right expertise moving into these new types of oversight positions in oversight regulatory agencies, but also in other key positions in other kind of stakeholders, and even internally, of course, to companies. And I think that is a place where in many ways the real battle is, that kind of building that future expertise that is needed to understand these issues and getting these people out. So that expertise is partly a legal expertise, and the avalanche, tsunami of legislation, it even means that experts, relative experts like me, are struggling to keep up with what is EU law in my area. What is it actually? Really knowing the latest developments and understanding the nuts and bolts of particular legislative files when they are completed. But it is of course a much bigger challenge, and I think so in the legal domain and getting legal and political talent, lined up that understands all these dynamics. But there's a much bigger challenge that I think digital rights organizations in the digital rights field, activism field more generally, can play a very important role is in building that expertise and working also in that together with others. It's a bit of a softer agenda, but ultimately it's a very, very important political battle. And I'm a little bit worried that sometimes the battle gets lost there and keep like the people that are really understanding things, they're not end up being the dominant voices in some of those agencies, so including like in the GDPR space.
Good point. I guess so. Next up, applying for jobs at the DPAs. Alexander, you left us on a cliffhanger before. Do you want to follow up on that, or do you want to react to any of the speakers?
Learning to unmute my microphone after 2 years of pandemic. I don't remember what the cliffhanger was, but I certainly agree to what Joris just said, that we will need a lot of qualified staff on technical level, on legal level, and so on to do all this oversight and all this monitoring. This is going to be a very interesting challenge. And it's something that Frances Hogan mentioned as well, the Facebook whistleblower, in her hearing at the European Parliament, that there are very few people who actually know what kind of data do you need to ask for if you want to monitor the big platforms, especially Facebook and her. So that is a very, very, very interesting question. Yeah. What else? What was the cliffhanger? I don't think I left.
Nothing precisely. You were saying that I have much more to say, but I will leave it for later. But perhaps there was nothing concrete.
My first intervention, and I caught up with the second one. Yeah, I think the AI Act is going to be a really huge challenge, because there I really see that the influence of industry is extremely strong, because it is also so difficult to come up with alternative proposals. For example, I was in committee before, and we had the Director General of DG Connect speaking about AI, and we could ask questions. And one of the questions I asked was, how can you involve affected groups of people. So the people who will be particularly affected by artificial intelligence are not the ones that are developing AI tools right now, because it's women, it's people of color, it's poor people, people with disabilities, and so on. And they're extremely unlikely to be involved in the development of those tools and also in the regulation of those tools, but they will be most impacted and most negatively impacted. And how can we involve them in the first place? And he just ignored the question. I have to say, you know, we have these formats like 2 minutes, and then you ask three questions, so they pick the question they want to answer. But I think nobody has a really precise solution how that could work. You know, there's no ready-made solution where you say, okay, you put that amendment into the regulation and it's done. You have to sort of think out of the box and develop solutions. And I think that would be an interesting challenge as well for NGOs to sort of come up together to start this discussion. How could we operationalize fundamental rights and inclusion of everybody in the conversation? What does it exactly mean? You know, we are speaking a lot about redress, and consumer organizations have the possibility to have redress, but I think that's not enough. I think we really have to come up with a solution, because that's something the Commission can't do. This is something that has to be done grassroots and by all of us brainstorming together and coming together and coming up with something that we then all defend. I think there is a chance to get things into the regulation, but we need to operationalize it and not just stay at the level saying, well, we want fundamental rights. And even the human rights assessment it's a great thing, but then you have the problem, you know, which fundamental rights and where's the balance? It's too abstract. I think we need some very precise, concrete ideas to put into that regulation, and that's maybe something you could do as NGOs, and then come to us as politicians, discuss it, and see how we can operationalize it and pour it into amendments.
Thank you, Sandra. Very good comments. We have only 5 minutes left. I'd like to follow up on the issue of the human rights impact assessment, because I also struggle to imagine how they will look in practice and how will they protect people in practice. But Joris, you have your hand raised, so please go ahead. And after Joris' intervention, I'd like to take 30 seconds each to try to have a break. We're talking about what happened so far, what's coming up in the immediate term, what NGOs should do. But I'd like to think in a 2024, 2029 legislative term, and what to expect from that. We were saying that perhaps we should focus on implementation, go to campaigning, go to national member state. But whether we like it or not, and I personally like it, there will be a new commission, a new parliament. So we will need to say if we propose something, or what we propose is pushing institutions to enforce the existing legislation. But Joris, please go ahead, and then we go to the general question for hopes and prospects.
Yeah, I wanted to say there's something about the AI Act that I think is quite characterizes it a bit in a way, the dynamics, which is, I think this is an act that has been put on the table mostly because it's been a big industry push to frame the conversation about, you know, certain kind of algorithmic systems in that kind of way. And the main goal for industry is to create predictable markets, you know, in Europe and mostly also like one market for AI, you know, like and many different things. And so there's many years that go before that, and a whole kind of campaign and framing the conversation. And then at some point it lands and the European Commission comes with a proposal, you know, after the whole expert group kind of thing. And so that whole process before has been quite dominated by a particular framing coming, the conversation coming from industry. So looking to the next period, I think, you know, EDRI can maybe come together and, you know, put your heads together. What is one of those types of things that you want to do, where you like really frame the conversation slowly and move, you know, towards that type of target? I mean, there are some really important conversations happening now, and you're doing a really great job on. But yeah, I think there is an opportunity there. I think to have a longer term kind of investment in building a file and working also then with the institutions that can, you know, that can help to maybe materialize that agenda.
Thank you, Joris. Anna, I see you already ready to react.
I think institution influencing is a really important future activity. And there's also, you know, a really good expression for NGOs called watchdogs, we have to be more watchdog orientated than maybe not so much new legislation influencing, but actually to lend the expertise, be watchdogs, and also research and finding the evidence is very, very important. Also in enforcement. And finally, don't forget, we are talking about global issues and global companies, and Europe is not a fortress. So we also need to know how to engage beyond European borders, because, like with COVID, until we get the whole world on the same page, it's not going to resolve our problems.
Wise words, Anna. Thank you. Asha, final comments before we go to the closing ceremony?
I will try and be as quick as I can, but I think like in Alexandra's case, you often get a short amount of time to try and get a lot of concepts across. But I would plus one on the ideas of kind of cross dissemination of expertise when it comes to civil society. I think there's actually opportunities for us to do the development of, say, legislation and operationalization processes in a much more interinstitutional way. I think in part of these conversations, we've talked about the kind of democratic processes and how civil society can have a real impact. And I know Claire mentioned in the comments there about making sure civil society remains part of the trilogues process, which is the biggest question, I think, for civil society right now. How do we maintain our impact in there and protect what we've been able to win in the European Parliament? So really fundamentally changing as we look to the future, how do we have an actual real multi-stakeholder approach that is based on the European values of democratic participation rather than consultation after the fact, or having a few people who can champion us being in those spaces, but it's not coherent. And then to think forward to 2024, it's a long time in political terms, but we have to think, because what we're talking about is generational defining legislation. It's going to go beyond the next 5 years. We need to think in those terms. So continuity, I think, is a main message I would pick up on. And definitely the focus on effective implementation. What we don't want with things that we have, like the DSA, is to have the same conversation that we've been having on, say, the Racial Equality Directive 20 years later, where we then say it wasn't effective. We now need to think of something else to make this work. So effective enforcement, continuity, and real interinstitutional and multi-stakeholder approach to how we do this.
Fantastic summary, Asha. Plus one to that. Alexandra, very quick words. We are already over time. Otherwise, you have something. Go ahead, please.
I'll be very quick. I think on trilogues, where the question was how to influence trilogue, influence national governments. I mean, the only ones who have really an influence on trilogues now on the pound that can change the council position are national governments. So where you see there might be a change in national governments because there's new evidence, because there's a new political constellation or something, you have parties in that governments you can talk to. That's what we need to do, and maybe coordinate a little bit with us, because obviously we have an idea as well which governments are moving in what direction. If you have any sources in council, extremely helpful. Use your member organization in the member states to do that. I think that is what really helps. Let's coordinate on the main goals. I think that's helpful. On 24 to 29, I have no idea. Digital world is moving so fast. One thing I would suspect, the research coming out of the DSA, the access to the data, Article 31, the work US NGOs will be doing, the work US researchers will be doing, that will give us new stories, but also new evidence in order to find out which way to go. And there might be some follow-up on legislation to the DSA, sectoral legislation related to the DSA, and somehow that's something I would see. Thank you.
Thank you. Very fantastic last words. Now we need to finish. We are 3 minutes after our time. We need to go to the closing ceremony, which is in the Alice room. So I just want to finalize. I think this panel could have lasted for another hour at least. So thank you so much. Thank you, Alexandra, Anna, Asha, and Joris for being with us. Fantastic panels. I'm looking forward to actually watch it again and take even more notes. So thank you so much, and see you soon.
Thank you. Goodbye.